the Virtual Policy Dialogue on Global Commons and Climate Action. This is the policy dialogue is being organized as a part of COP27 Compass under the Act for Earth initiative of TERI. Before we begin the event proceedings, we request all the speakers to turn on their camera for a quick photo. Thank you, everyone. I had the pleasure to invite Dr. Pradipto Ghosh, Distinguished Fellow TERI, to deliver the welcome address. He has occupied many positions in the Indian government, including the position of Economic Advisor and Additional Secretary to the PM. He retired as Secretary, Ministry of Environment and Forest. He was also a member of India's negotiating team at the UNFCCC negotiation from 2001 to 2012. The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you, Nivedita. And let me welcome all the participants to this very important TERI event, which is intended to lead up to COP27 and is focused on the issues which were included in the Glasgow outcome on the interface between global commons, in particular the oceans, and climate. The term commons in the economics literature refers to resources over which property rights are not assigned, and accordingly everyone has an incentive to extract as much of the resource as possible before it is depleted. The economist's prescription for conservation of the commons is to assign property rights to the relevant agents. As long as the sum of such rights does not exceed the rate of regeneration, the resource may be expected to survive. Economics has little to say about the principles or processes governing the assignment of such property rights, but economists try nevertheless. Several resources may count as global commons. Ocean resources, sea lanes for marine traffic, satellite orbits and extraterrestrial bodies, Antarctica, maybe even the electromagnetic spectrum, and there are others. The one resource which has the greatest political salience at present is rights to the atmosphere, specifically rights of countries to carbon space. Now, the rights to carbon space has been caricatured by some Western scholars as the right to pollute. Developing country researchers, on the other hand, point to the fact that carbon space is an economic resource and binding constraints on carbon emissions may, ceteris paribus, lead to curtailment of economic growth. The sharing of carbon space across countries is also deeply suffused with geopolitical strategic interests. This is the essence of the international negotiation on climate change under the UNFCCC. The current fuzzy scheme of sharing carbon space across countries is contained in the Paris Agreement 2015. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
Dr. Ghosh. Yes, Dr. Ghosh, we can hear you. Can you?
I think somebody has switched off my video.
Can you try to switch it on if you're able to? It's not connected.
Now, the current fuzzy scheme of sharing carbon space across countries is contained in the Paris Agreement of 2015. The role of the oceans in global climate has become important after COP26. There are two important aspects to keep in mind. First, the role of the oceans as heat sink and absorber of GHG emissions is a pure global public good. Sharing of carbon space implicitly involves sharing of this function of the oceans. Any other scheme for direct sharing of this function of the oceans would conflict with the scheme of sharing of the carbon space painstakingly worked out at the UNFCCC and may lead to its unraveling. Given this, the scope for multilateral cooperation should focus on ways to mitigate the adverse impacts of climate change on the oceans, including ocean acidification, depletion, migration of fish stocks, impacts on biodiversity such as coral reefs, etc. Such cooperation will involve sharing of some rights over ocean resources and responsibilities for taking or refraining from specified actions. These in turn will have economic implications. Climate change may also make some existing resource sharing arrangements, such as fisheries agreements, moot. In working out such cooperation, established principles such as CBTR and RC must be relied upon. There is a sorry history of negotiations on UNCLOS in the 1970s, when these principles were not as well established, resulting in huge disadvantages to developing countries. Some years ago on a vacation, I was intrigued by the appearance of tar balls on Goa's famed beaches. On investigating their origin, I learned that this was due to a UNCLOS provision that allowed oil tankers to discharge bilge water during their transit through the Indian Ocean. They are not so allowed off the coast of Europe, North America, Japan, and Australia. We may be sure that developing countries negotiators will be much more vigilant this time around. So let me once again welcome all the participants to this important workshop and hope that your deliberations will provide some guideposts on the way forward. Thank you very much indeed, and back to you, Nivedita.
Thank you so much, sir. We request all the speakers to switch on the camera when they speak. Now, I invite Ms. Nivedita Chalai, Research Associate TERI, and Dr. Ashwini Pai Panantikar, Fellow TERI, for a presentation on global commons and climate action.
Thanks, Palak. Thanks, Palak. We'll start the presentation on global commons and climate action. This will be based on the preliminary findings of the TERI research team. We want to first acknowledge our partners for supporting us through the Act for Earth initiative and the COP Compass and SDG Charter components. And I would also like to thank and acknowledge the study team and our advisor, Dr. Ghosh, for their contributions to to bringing this policy brief together and for the contribution to the policy dialogue. To give a background, COP27 Compass is part of the Act for Earth initiative, which was launched as the World Sustainable Development Summit 2022 valedictory session with an objective to drive ambition and urgent action on climate change as well as sustainable development through knowledge building, dialogue creation, and capacity building. Act for Earth has two components, COP27 Compass and SDG Charter. The COP27 Compass is particularly focused on amplifying perspectives from the global south, which is crucial for equitable climate action. Coming to the topic at hand, global commons. Global commons are extensive resource domains which do not fall under the jurisdiction of any one country. The two characteristics of global commons is there is a high difficulty of barring others from using them, and there is a high subtractability, as in the use by one person or one unit can reduce the amount available to another person. The international law recognizes 4 global commons: oceans or high seas, atmosphere, Antarctica, and the outer space. The governance of global commons become very contentious since there is no single state or region having complete responsibility for their governance. Why global commons? Like I said, it is vital for the survival of all species on this planet. It has very direct linkages to climate action and climate change. Rising sea temperature and high sea levels or overfishing, as well as acidification, marine litter, and pollution, makes it crucial to take action in protecting and governing these global commons. Also, it is an up and coming topic in the academic literature. It is under research in terms of the governance structures. There is still a lot of research that needs to be done between the delineation of the national and the global jurisdiction of these commons. And in terms of their role in climate action, especially considering vulnerable countries and the global south. The scope and rationale of this particular study is we'll be focusing mainly on oceans, the marine areas beyond the national jurisdiction, and their relation to the climate action by examining the interface between the climate and the ocean governance. The reason why we consider oceans to be one of the main topics is because of its, first of all, its magnitude. 70% of Earth's surface is covered by oceans, of which the marine areas beyond national jurisdiction make up 40%. And 60% of the surface of the oceans and nearly 95% of its volume. And it is also the only global common shared by all at the same time. There is also direct relevance to climate action. Oceans absorb heat and regulate temperature of the planet, and climate change impacts such as sea level rise, acidification, loss of marine biodiversity, and integrity of ecosystem makes it very important to study this particular global common in depth in terms of both governance as well as its relevance to climate action. In terms of governance of global commons, in terms of climate governance, we have the UNFCCC, under which we have the Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol. The relevance to environmental action, as I said, there are GHG emissions, ozone depletion, and acid deposition in the atmosphere. And in terms of oceans, we have the UNCLOS as well as the ongoing BBNJ negotiations, as well as the Convention on the Biological Diversity. And the relevance to environmental action is in terms of addressing sea level rise, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and marine pollution. This image shows the different actors in the international governance area, which is directly relevant to oceans and climate governance. And currently, these are very fragmented. And through our policy dialogue and through our policy brief, what we want to bring out is how to strengthen the interface between different actors and how to what are the different ways, what are the reforms that is needed to bring them together, to address, govern, and to protect these global commons. Over to you, Ashwini.
Nivedita. Hi, everyone. My name is Ashwini, and in a couple of next slides I'll be presenting. So this slide here talks about, gives you a snapshot basically about how ocean has been treated in the global climate negotiations. So historically, climate and ocean policies have been, looked at in silos, and they were not included. And this was brought forth by IPCC in 2009, when they said in their report that this oversight is conflicting with incredible role that oceans play in regulating Earth's climate, as well as numerous manifestations of climate change in the marine environment. So up to COP 2021, the ocean was usually omitted from the negotiation altogether. And Paris Agreement, however, mentions the importance of oceans in the preamble. But in the negotiations till COP 2021, they were not included. It was not included. So following COP23, which was spearheaded by Fiji, the increase in the indigenous representation and concerted focus on the ocean climate nexus was noticed. And finally, the ocean and climate change dialogue was mandated in COP25. And now, most recent COP26, the major outcome was that governments permanently anchoring the inclusion of strengthened ocean-based action under the UNFCCC by multilateral process in Glasgow Climate Pact 2021. Next slide, please. So the most recent Glasgow negotiations finally noted the importance of oceans and its importance in integrating the ecosystems, including forest, ocean, and cryospheres. It emphasized the importance of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems, including marine systems, ecosystems. And finally, it invited the relevant work programs and constituted bodies under UNFCCC to consider how to integrate and strengthen ocean-based action. As Nivedita recently, just few slides ago, she showed the picture where there are different actors working in this space, and there is a need to integrate what each of them is doing so that the results are more meaningful and actionable. Next slide, please. So based on our study, this policy brief has few recommendations, and I'll read it out to you. One of the outcomes of COP26 is holding an annual ocean and climate change dialogues. But however, participation and inclusion of all the other stakeholders is key in this dialogues. There is a need for definite goals, targets, and indicators beyond what is already covered in SDG 14. There is institutional and enforcement mechanism to steer the ocean climate action which is needed. Indicators also are needed, which should put input, output, and outcome indicators. International cooperation and financial resources is critical to actionability of the outcomes of COP26 and beyond. And here, key question of coordination, reforms, and multilateral systems is required. Sustained global ocean observations and projections of ocean physics, chemistry, and biology are essential to inform better short and long-term policy making for the benefit of people, nature, and the economy. Invest in international coordination and integration of ocean observation is also required. So finally, it is very important to understand the interface between international climate and ocean governance, especially UNFCCC Convention on Law of Seas and Convention of Biological Diversity, which is relevant to oceans. So we look forward to all the panelists, the interactions, and your inputs based on your experience and your expertise. Thank you. Over to you, Nivedita.
Thank you, Ms. Nivedita and Dr. Ashwini. Now we will proceed with the panel discussion. Now I invite Dr. Sherry Kedia to take over the discussion from here.
Thank you so much, Palak. Welcome, everyone. I would like to thank Dr. Ghosh for setting the context so well, and my colleagues Nivedita and Ashwini, who has joined us from our Goa office and who is very much there, very near the oceans, for making the presentation, the framing presentation for our policy brief. I would like to just begin by saying that, this is going to be a part of the policy brief, and we look forward to your insights on the questions posed. Just for the, for the sake of the, just to flag them again. the guiding questions that we are looking at, what kind of transformations, what kind of reforms within the multilateral system, institutions are we looking at if we are talking about protecting and governing the global commons, in particularly looking at the interface between ocean governance and international climate governance. And how can global commons be further mainstreamed into climate action agenda at various levels and across governance structures and institutional mechanisms in various international organizations? And how can we better factor the lens of equity? And we know that whether it is global commons, whether it's principles like the common heritage to the mankind principles, there's always been like a divergence between the global south and the global north. And so will be the case, when we will talk about, multilateral reforms that will concern the oceans as well as climate. So then, what are those dynamics and how do we think that we can kind of, come to a middle ground, but yet ensure that, this is our only planet that we're talking about, and we can really like meaningfully and collectively work towards that. So I would like to start by inviting Professor Archana Negi, who is an associate professor at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. And to me, she's taught environmental negotiations. So, I mean, in a way, I'm just, so happy that she's agreed. And, my first exposure from a international organization lens really was from her. In fact, very, 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 very enriching classes, Professor Negi. And thank you so much for taking the time out. But I'd just like to say that she teaches at the Center for International Politics Organization and Disarmament at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU in Delhi. And she offers courses related to international negotiations, international organization, and world politics. Over to you, Professor Negi.
Thank you, Shelley. I hope I'm audible to everyone. Yes, okay. All right. So very good afternoon to everyone here, all the panelists, the hosts and others. Shelley, always happy and proud to see you here, as always. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh, for setting the stage for discussions. And thank you, TERI, and also the Embassy of Egypt, which I believe is the co-partner for the program in general, for organizing this and for having me here as well. I'm, of course, delighted to be a part of this virtual policy dialogue on global commons and climate action. And also very happy to learn about TERI's Act for Earth initiative and the COP27 Compass, which I read about in the background papers. I guess by highlighting issues pertinent to the global south, this becomes, for a change, a compass that does not by default always point north. So I was happy to read about this. So I'd like to set the stage for discussion in three parts. First, to look at contexts. As we are on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh, I will start by highlighting what some of the expectations are from this event, focusing more, of course, towards the end on the expectations of the global south. But first, the context of the COP needs to be kept in mind. And I would briefly like to point to three contexts to begin with. First is the natural context, of course, provided by the environmental context, right? The backdrop in which the conference is being held only emphasizes the worsening of the problem and the running out of time for fixing the problem. So we have just seen another summer of extreme weather, including in the global north. The summer of 2022 saw the warmest temperatures on record over the world's land areas, record-breaking heat waves sweeping across the northern hemisphere, and all of us were following these through the papers. Continental Europe, UK, China, US. The Antarctic sea ice was at record low levels in the first half of the year, and the Arctic sea ice at the low end of the historical range as well. So the developed countries or the global north as well is beginning to get this first-hand experience of issues like failed harvests and heat stress, etc. Then closer home, we had Pakistan seeing devastating floods, claiming the lives of close to 1,500 people, wiping out crops, homes, infrastructure, etc., across almost a third of the country. And what is important to note here is that a country that is responsible for less than 1% of global GHG emissions finds itself very high on the vulnerability index of extreme weather due to climate change. Just last week, you had the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres visiting Pakistan and referring to the lack of attention given to climate change as quote unquote insanity and collective suicide. So the sort of context within which, or the year or time within which we are holding this conference is something we need to, of course, take into account. The second is the locational context. And by locational context, I mean, of course, the fact that COP27 will take place in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, under the conference slogan, Together for Implementation. Only 4 times before this has climate conference been hosted in Africa. So twice in Morocco, in Marrakesh, once in Nairobi, and once in Durban, South Africa, which we all remember. So this conference is billed as an African COP, and not just with reference to its location, but also in the expectation that African interests as countries particularly exposed to and vulnerable to the impacts of climate change will be brought and kept center stage. The Global Climate Risk Index of 2021, which identifies the worst hit from extreme weather events related to climate change, like storms, floods, etc., both in terms of human fatalities and direct economic losses, and they take into account data from 2000 to 2019, has come up with the following 3 broad results. One, confirming that LDCs are generally more affected than the industrialized countries. Second, from the period 2000 to 2019, the worst affected included Puerto Rico, Myanmar, and Haiti. And in 2019, the countries and territories most affected were Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and the Bahamas. So the locational context of COP27 should focus then in particular on African vulnerabilities and especially aspects of adaptation that are also crucial concerns for the global South at large. The third is the geopolitical context of COP27. COP26, which was mentioned before, took place amidst very unstable conditions in the backdrop of the pandemic. And while those uncertainties have not receded completely, an additional threat to international cooperation has emerged from the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has essentially led to cause disruptions in any attempted collaboration in all fields, including climate action. One example of which is the G20, the group of the world's major economies, which accounts for 80% of global emissions, and usually has served as an important staging post for climate action at previous COPs. But now, 2 implications of the war in Ukraine would be, one, that G20 as a group has been destabilized because the members are not really talking to each other anymore. And a reminder of the July 2022 meeting where the Russian foreign minister walked out stating, quote, "There is nothing to talk about with the West," unquote. The second impact of this war is that the larger issues of food and energy insecurity, and especially the dramatic price rises, would mean pushing climate change down the domestic political agenda. There are other implications. For instance, one of the outcomes of COP26, which was the US-China climate accord, has fallen apart post the visit by Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, etc. So all I'm trying to say here is that the success of COP27 is contingent on goodwill between the parties for international cooperation, but goodwill is in severe shortage in the current geopolitical context. So these three contexts, the natural, locational, and geopolitical contexts, are important to keep in mind as we head towards and as we assess the conference at Sharm el-Sheikh. Now coming to the second part of my intervention, what do we have on the table at the conference? And this is really by way of a summary or a revision that we are all familiar with, but basically to tease out from here what the Global South could be focusing on. So one, of course, mitigation remains a very key concern at COP27 as well. COP26 had seen the ambition-raising function of the Paris Agreement for mitigation being put to a test, where countries were asked to submit new or updated NDCs ahead of COP26, and many countries did. It was over 120 parties which submitted new NDCs. A full implementation of these new targets will still mean an estimated warming of about 2.4 degrees C by the end of the century. So at the close of COP26 at Glasgow, it had been declared, that though 1.5 degrees remains alive, quote, its pulse is weak, unquote. So the Glasgow Climate Pact did request parties to strengthen their 2030 targets in their NDCs in order to align with the Paris goal by the end of 2022. And in some sense, COP27 will see some reference to this so-called unfinished business of Glasgow, which means where are countries heading in terms of mitigation targets. Very few countries so far have submitted new or revised NDCs, and so COP27 will really open up discussion on mitigation. The second important issue there is that of adaptation, which for long in climate action has been overshadowed by mitigation, both in terms of attention as well as in terms of financing. The Glasgow Climate Pact had urged the developed countries to at least double adaptation financing, and it also launched the 2-year work program on the global goal on adaptation to help countries to adapt, increase resilience to climate change. Adaptation will certainly be high on the agenda, given the fact, as I said before, that COP27 is taking place in a highly climate vulnerable country and also continent. The third issue, which will remain extremely pertinent, is that of climate finance, and again from the perspective of the Global South as well. At COP26, developing countries had expressed frustration over the failure to deliver on the promises of regular finance to assist in adaptation and mitigation efforts as well. And therefore, at COP27, what we are looking at is likely a push both for fulfillment of the historic promises, which refers back to the 100 billion annual climate finance each year, which so far remains unmet. And also newer initiatives like the launch of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or the GFANZ, which emerged from COP26. The fourth issue, which is again very pertinent from the perspective of the Global South, is that of loss and damage. As the story goes, the developing countries who contribute less to climate change, they seek financial support towards the cost of loss and damage. On this issue, there were some breakthroughs at COP26, including the establishment of the 3-year Glasgow Dialogue. There were some symbolic pledges as well, but a formal dealing with the issue of loss and damages is something that will continue to be a high priority for countries coming from the Global South. And then there is the issue of the global stocktake, the process for taking stock of the implementation of the Paris Agreement with the aim of assessing progress towards the long-term goals. This is from Article 14 of the Paris Agreement. So the idea is also to identify gaps and opportunities for enhanced action and support. Now, each stocktake, as we all know, is this 2-year process that is to happen every 5 years. And this is in sync with the ratchet mechanism. The outcomes will inform the NDCs as well as the negotiations. This assessment of progress on all aspects of mitigation, adaptation, and implementation will come out of the GST. The first stock take is already underway, as you know, since Glasgow. So there are 3 phases under which it's being done. The phase 1 was about collecting and preparing information, which is underway. Phase 2 is about the technical assessment, part of which will be a part of the COP27 as well. It will be hosted as a technical dialogue. And phase 3, which will end up with presenting key findings at COP28 at the end of 2023. Now, 2 things about the GST, the global stock take. One, that by design, it is meant to be or designed to be participatory. So it allows for space for stakeholders to provide inputs, etc. Also, the provision of thematic analyses. I'm just pointing out 2 hooks where the Global South can actually make an entry point. So thematic analysis, for example, on agriculture or health or transport, etc. Bringing these in would allow for a more granular exercise, that identifies constraints and leads to a more composite exercise as far as the global stocktake is concerned. Also at Glasgow, there had been several sectoral issues. We all, remember the coal, cars, cash, trees language that Glasgow had used, and COP27 would be important for assessing progress on all these deals. So the GST is critically important to assess these transformations, etc. Also, last year's NDC synthesis report confirmed that the trajectory of stabilizing global temperature rise at 1.5 degrees is still distant. So the need for more ambitious climate action is, of course, necessary. So as somebody has noted very eloquently, that if national climate plans, and I'm quoting here, if national climate plans or NDCs are the beating heart of the Paris Agreement, then the GST is the agreement's regular health check. So that more or less explains also the importance. Now, coming finally to the last bit that I have to speak about, which is the thematic of this panel, that is global commons and climate action. Now, the guiding questions that you've addressed, basically cover 3 main themes. 1, transformations. 2nd, the question of interlinking, and 3rd, the question of equity. And I will just briefly make a point or 2 about each of these. The first issue about, or the first question asked about transformations, of course, leads us to, a conclusion that any transformation that we aim at will need to take into consideration the peculiar problems faced by any attempt to govern the global commons. And Dr. Ghosh made reference in the beginning to the problem of the global commons, the resource domains that do not fall under the jurisdiction of any one single country. Now, anthropogenic overexploitation of these commons was flagged decades ago. And just a reminder to everyone about the article published in 1968 by Garrett Hardin on the tragedy of the commons, in which he argued that any open access resource is vulnerable to tragic destruction. And he gave the famous example where he said, you picture a pasture that is open to all and everyone is going to graze it, till it is no longer sustainable, etc., and bring ruin to it. Now, where environmental or climate problems are concerned, the maximization of individual gain, therefore, and we can also read this from the context of national interest, often comes then at the cost of degradation of communal resources. Right? Of course, we can't forget that Elinor Ostrom, who received the Nobel Prize in 2019 for her research, demonstrated quite the contrary, that ordinary people are capable of creating rules and institutions that allow for the sustainable and equitable management of shared resources. So she analyzed economic governance, and especially the commons, studied the interaction of peoples and ecosystems for many years. And her research showed that the use of exhaustible resources by groups of people can be a rational act, a rational exercise that can be carried out without government intervention. In any case, not dwelling too much on the academics of it, the transformations that are needed to protect and govern global commons, such as atmosphere and also oceans, which have been discussed, will basically need to draw from an understanding of the peculiar nature of the task of governing the global commons. Three of which that I identify are: one, not owning the problem due to its perceived extra-jurisdictional location. In other words, this is not my problem. Second, treating the commons as the externality of human activity, right? Economic activity and otherwise, but treating it like an externality, not factoring it into the costs of our everyday activities. And third, the temptations to free ride, right? All three have been the core problems in addressing the issues relating to the global commons. And now that you frame climate within this framework, this is something we'll have to see. The second point about interlinkages of the health and well-being of the global commons, this is hinted upon in your concept note as well. And now I see the full-fledged report where TERI is doing this interlinking, very, very welcome interlinking between oceans and climate. It is important to keep an eye on other environmental agreements that could contribute to the overall climate objectives being pursued through the Paris Agreement track. Let me remind you of the 2016 Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer, the amendment that entered into force in 2019. This amendment brought about a phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs, by cutting their production and consumption. And HFCs had, prior to that, been used as replacements of hydrochlorofluorocarbons and chlorofluorocarbons, which, however, were then discovered to be powerful greenhouse gases. So the goal of the amendment was to achieve over 80% reduction in HFC consumption by 2047. And it was assessed that the impact of the amendment would be avoiding up to 0.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures by the end of the century. Basically contributing to the global objective that is also in the Paris Agreement, the 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees. At the time, the press had reported the adoption of the Kigali Amendment as, quote, Montreal Protocol evolves to fight climate change. So only to say that things relating to climate are happening elsewhere, and that is something very, very important, the interlinkages point that has been raised by this conference or this policy dialogue. In other interlinked issue areas, the High Ambition Coalition of more than 50 countries which have committed to protecting the world's oceans, the UN Ocean Treaty to protect and manage the high seas are ongoing. Some details have already been discussed by the presenters who presented the TERI report about 30% of the world's oceans, the high seas, the areas beyond national jurisdictions. Oceans for a very long time did remain largely absent from the global discussion on climate change, and certainly there is a recognition that this will need to change. Increasingly, it is understood that to protect and restore the oceans, we need to tackle climate change, and vice versa, that these are twin crises that need to be addressed in a complementary fashion. So there are several sort of recent reports that are published on principles for ocean climate action, and how far the integration of the ocean issues into the Paris Agreement is taken forth in COP27 is something, again, that one would need to look at. Finally, coming to the third question, which is about equity, right? What are the ways of governance? The most sort of significant discussion, given that this discussion is taking place under the COP27 compass, is how to spotlight equity in this endeavor. Now, some of the issues to be taken up at COP27 are already marked as having special significance for the interests of the global South, those relating to adaptation, for example, also climate finance, loss and damage in particular. African countries and other developing countries have consistently been calling for adequate, equitable, and accessible climate finance to meet their adaptation needs. Relative to mitigation, and I said this before, adaptation finance is underfunded So OECD tells you, for example, that finance for adaptation only accounted for 25% of global climate finance flows. Likewise, there is the UNEP's adaptation gap report, but I'm not going into the details there. Even where finance is available, there are barriers in relation to the ease of access, and the procedural requirements are so onerous that it's very difficult to actually reach the financing opportunities. Further, a big problem that has been flagged by the developing countries already is that whatever little finance is available for adaptation is further diluted by the commingling of finance for loss and damage with finance for adaptation, right? So newer sort of calls which have been sent forth by the developing countries, for example, a dedicated finance for nature-based solutions, which would include the capacity to respond to both adaptation and mitigation, etc. The last point that I'd like to say that these are the traditional sort of global South positions on more focus on adaptation, especially more focus on adaptation financing, etc., more robust recognition of loss and damage. But I would like to add to this that the developing countries also need to ensure a very, very active and robust participation in the global stocktake exercise. Stressing especially on the sectoral analysis that are of concern to them. For example, highlighting health and other thematic cross-sectoral priorities that are ingrained in the goals of the Paris Agreement, such as food security, human rights, equity, etc. All of this would ensure that the societal implications of the current levels of climate action are well understood. So as I see it, the design of the GST suggests that equitable outcomes from this exercise will depend on equal participation in the process of stocktake. And given that the stocktake is really going to define and design the future of the climate negotiations, this is something that the Global South needs to take very, very seriously. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much for allowing me these minutes for intervention. Back to you, Shelley.
Thank you so much, Professor Negi. Always a pleasure to listen to you. And thank you so much for sharing your perspectives on transformation, interlinkages, and equity, and also sharing your perspectives on global commons, the problems associated with it, and also some of the recent initiatives and the fact that the Global South needs to continuously play a role in terms of participating in the global stocktake. And of course, perhaps here also in the themes, one can see oceans, hopefully also featured in. I mean, of course, there was one analysis of all the NDCs submitted, and there was so little focus on oceans. And this is, of course, that's in the sovereign domain. But when it comes to global commons, again, this is a missing area. Even in terms of scientific assessments, we need much more to really understand, what the solutions could be involving the global commons. But the fact is that I remember there was this one campaign wherein in 2020 the whole campaign was about removing the S in the oceans because everything is so interlinked. Also the fact that even the global the areas beyond national jurisdiction will have an impact on the national jurisdiction. So there is a need for collective action. But moving forward, yes, it will be, even as a researcher, one will have to think a lot more on how to make those linkages, how to define that interface and propose something that is also like, something that is implementable, but also, proposing something bold that kind of challenges the existing paradigms as well. So next, I would like to call Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi, who is the chairperson of the Department of International Relations at the South Asian University. And thank you so much, Professor, for joining us.
Shelley,
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. May I please excuse myself with apologies to my panelists? As I informed you, I have an offline event for which I have to leave now. And
Sure.
I'm very sorry. I would normally have loved to stay till the end of the panel, but I simply can't because of this prior commitment. So please excuse me.
That's why I invited you first. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Shelley. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
So do we have Professor Sachin? Okay, I saw him, but just like he's not there right now. But so then maybe we can move on to Dr. Kapil Narula. Yes. So Kapil, I'd just like to invite you just to introduce Kapil. Do we have Kapil here?
I am here, Shani.
Yes, yes. Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Kapil. And thank you so much for joining us for this event, which is a part of COP27 Campus. We had the first one yesterday in collaboration with the COP27 presidency and Egypt. We have the second one today, which is focusing on global commons. And Kapil is currently with the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Africa and is based in Beirut. But he has over 20 years of experience in research and policy interface. But also, I'd just like to say an interesting fact about Kapil that he's also been with the Indian Navy. And for me, I've been associated with Kapil on oceans, and I thought that he really has very interesting perspectives to share, especially with respect to the interface between ocean and climate governance. So, Kapil, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Shelley. I just wanted to inquire, probably Dr. Archana had to leave earlier. Should we address all the questions in one go, or would you have rounds so that, all panelists can participate?
Yes, Kapil, I think you can go in one go itself. Yes. And then,
Okay.
when there are follow-up questions after all the speakers have spoken, we'll come back to you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you once again, and also to the organizers and Dr. Ghosh to set the stage. A disclaimer: these views are personal, and don't represent the views of ESQA or my former affiliations. To start with, I think it is very important to set the stage specifically on the oceans, and I would like to start with three salient points about this issue. The first, which probably everyone knows, that over 60% of the global ocean is actually ABNJ, area beyond national jurisdiction. And only 1.2% of this is protected legally. The goal, like Dr. Archana said, or the target is to protect at least 30% of world's ocean by 2030. And this gap between the current 1.2% and 30% target is really huge. The second salient feature which I would like to highlight is that we should recognize that ocean issues, they are all interconnected. Not only because oceans are physically connected, but also because it's intercoupled with the global climate. And the third aspect, which is a salient feature of ocean governance, is that the threats and the impacts on the oceans and the climate, they do not recognize maritime jurisdiction boundaries. That's a construct which countries or human beings have made. And therefore, ocean issues cannot be considered in isolation. Thus, there is a need for integrated action and consequently global governance of oceans. The next point, which is very, very specific to oceans is the global threats which emerge from climate change. In a very recent study last week, which was released, Potsdam Institute of Climate Change published its study in the journal Nature. And there they identified the 16 climate tipping points. And it said that at current levels of global heating, the world already lies within the lower end of 5 of these climate tipping points uncertainty ranges. And I'll not go to all 16, but of these 5, I'll just highlight these 5 tipping points, which have already been possibly triggered. The first is Greenland ice sheet. Second, West Antarctic ice sheet. Third, collapse of convection in the Labrador Sea. Fourth, massive die-offs of tropical coral reefs. And fifth is abrupt permafrost thaw. So you would have identified that 4 of these 5 climate tipping points are related to oceans. And that's the global threat which is facing the oceans. A characteristics of this threat is that one, it's transnational and the scale ranges from local to global. And there are interconnected feedback loops, which we really don't understand. And therefore, the impacts are very nonlinear and not well understood. So to close the setting of the stage, I think the guiding principle for ocean governance, which everyone recognizes, is that oceans are global commons. They are our shared heritage, and they have to be used for benefit of all. And that implies both inter as well as intergenerational equity. So moving on from here and trying to address the first specific question on what's the transformation needed to protect and govern the oceans. I will start by highlighting, some specific characteristics of ocean governance and what are the limitations or challenges in that. The first is all ocean governance professionals would know that ocean governance is primarily a multi-layered structure, and governance is carried out under several levels. One, global level, regional level, national level, as well as local level. And the shape and size of this is also very different. Some of them are formal treaties, other are sort of regional arrangements like the fishery arrangements. Some of them are more elastic in terms of political or voluntary commitments. And therefore, the multi-layered structure of ocean governance sort of makes it a very complicated governance arrangement. The second is that there are various overlaps and gaps, which was also pointed out in the report. And there is fragmented governance and measures, which actually is not a bad thing in itself, because they offer sometimes multiple layers of protection. But sometimes, they are also dysfunctional, incoherent, and they fail to consider the entire ecosystem as a whole, which is very, very essential. And we also see that there are many overlaps due to sectoral-based approaches. And that includes, jurisdictional overlaps due to different mandates and prioritization of different sectors. Sometimes there is a regulatory overlap because of the scope of coverage as well as application to different parties. And then there is overlap of actors, primarily which emerges from competition over resources and different activities. So I'll address only one aspect because it's a huge part. So I'll try and address one critical aspect of improving this. And I choose the topic of addressing the knowledge gaps in ocean governance, where I'd like to highlight a few points. The first is, we need to increase our scientific understanding of the oceans. For example, of deep sea, or intercoupling between ocean and climate, and various other aspects. The second aspect, which is very neglected, is that the world community is very, very slow to embrace traditional knowledge and the issues which are affecting the local communities. And I think that's one of the key areas where we should address or focus some of our attention, because these traditional communities have been staying together with the oceans, and they treat oceans as their own. So that's an important aspect. Third is there is also failure to consider marine ecosystems as a whole, where marine spatial planning and strategic environmental assessments can take a lead role in limiting the impact of economic activities on oceans. And of course, I did mention climate change and ocean atmospheric interactions, and how sometimes models, they fail to account for warming, acidification, and deoxygenation. And therefore, that is a critical knowledge gap which needs to be addressed. The last point is on, we rarely understand the impact of noise, ships, going through underwater noise, light and vibrations on marine environment as well as marine life, and which is very, very important, for biodiversity in the oceans. Moving on to the second specific question, on what are the actions for mainstreaming of ocean governance into climate ocean agenda. I'll highlight again an aspect of regulating the emerging activities in ABNJ. And I specifically would like to mention deep seabed mining and ocean geoengineering in this case. And it's extremely important that we adopt the precautionary principle for these high-risk activities, because we don't understand them enough. It might be too late. There are several impacts on biodiversity, on ocean health, and therefore, there are impacts from deep seabed mining, especially near hydrothermal vents, seamounts, and on ocean floor. And therefore, we need to carefully consider the development of mining code being steered by the international ISA versus the call for, some countries for a moratorium on mining. And I would compliment, France, who's supporting this call on moratorium on seabed mining. The issue of bottom trawling also is extremely important, and an issue, which is a specific action point. And Europe has significantly made progress. Only yesterday, I think there was an announcement from Europe to protect, to ban bottom trawling in EU waters under the deep sea access regulation framework. And they've actually closed down about 17% of the area between 400 to 800 meters depth. And this is about 16,500 kilometers square of area, and that's preserved, and no more bottom trawling activities will be carried out there. And the last aspect on this issue I would like to highlight is on freedom of high seas versus common heritage of mankind. And there you need to have, for an equitable approach, you need to adopt a balance. And we all know that the framework of the treaty on BBNJ, from which we had so much hopes, was concluded without any kind of further development or formalized legal arrangement. And that's been going on for 20 years now. And for equitable approach, I think marine genetic resources, benefit sharing is an important aspect. I'll quickly move. I know it's short of time, and not to I'll quickly move on to the third aspect of equitable approach. And there, I would need to just mention a few aspects that we need to re-envision our relationship with oceans and economic activity. We see that countries are adopting a sustainable approach, which is extremely good. But from a sustainability framework, we need to move on to a regenerative framework. And that positive action, I think that's one of the implementation aspects which will enable an equitable approach. The second is, for an equitable approach, we need to focus on blue financing for ocean protection. And there are, great examples of debt for nature swaps and blue bonds in Seychelles, as well as, use of insurance tools for Mexico coral reef insurance, which was triggered in October 2000 after a hurricane. So I think this protects vulnerable communities and is much more equitable. And the third, for an equitable approach, is to adopt an ecosystem approach and area-based tools such as marine spatial planning based on agreed scientific criteria. This is quite well known and well accepted. So the highlight or the emphasis which I would like to give on an equitable approach is to advance knowledge, ocean literacy, and involve the younger generation. And I think TERI is doing a great job on that front also. I'll close on these remarks for the moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kapil, and also flagging the fact that when it comes to aspects such as deep sea mining, the precautionary principle also is an important aspect that must be looked at, and also the fact that there is a lot of knowledge gap also that needs to be addressed when it comes to decision making and the interface. Thank you so much, Kapil. I see that Professor Chaturvedi is back, and I'd just like to introduce that Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi is the chairperson of the Department of International Relations at the South Asian University, sir. So we invite you to share your perspective on global commons. What would be important aspects from the global South perspective, and you could cover the aspects related to transformations that's needed. How could interlinkages and coordination be enhanced, as well as aspects of equity. Professor Chaturvedi, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Shelley. I am very grateful to TERI, whose work I have admired hugely over long years, and to all the organizers. Thank you so much for organizing this event and inviting me. Firstly, let me reflect a little more critically about what do we mean when we talk about global commons. I think sometimes when we use the term global commons with the common heritage of mankind, we are taken back to the times of UNCLOS 3. Our attention is diverted to the deep seabed. We start imagining International Seabed Authority and so on. Now that is important. There's absolutely no doubt that when we talk about maritime spaces beyond the spaces of national maritime jurisdiction, high seas become very important. And as compared to the areas within national maritime jurisdiction, governing the high seas is far more challenging, far more daunting. It requires very innovative institutional landscapes. It requires political trust. But then there are spaces which are somewhat contested global commons. They are very important, but they are contested. And here I have in my mind a place that I have worked on over the last 2-3 decades, and that is the polar regions. I am particularly interested in the Antarctic. Now, Antarctica, as we all know, is larger than India and China put together. It is a continent surrounded by what we call the Southern Ocean. And there is Antarctica Treaty of 1959, which was ratified in 1961, which defines south of 60 degrees south as the space, as the area of the Antarctic Treaty and Antarctic Treaty governance. Now, 60s, 70s, Antarctica was known as the continent of science, understandably, because the Antarctica Treaty was negotiated at the height of the Cold War against the backdrop of International Geophysical Year, 1957-58. But then 1970s, we saw a very important discursive transformation of Antarctica. And that is that the Antarctica then was being seen as, in terms of resource geopolitics. Now, before I get into this, which makes Antarctica far more contested, let me also invite your attention to the Antarctica Treaty. One of the provisions of the Antarctica Treaty, the contested territoriality of Antarctica is legally frozen. We know that there are 7 claims and counterclaims of territorial sovereignty, with 3 overlapping claims on Antarctica Peninsula, United Kingdom, Argentina, and Chile. Now, all these claims are legally frozen. Geopolitically, they have remained alive, and they have started asserting themselves in a sort of more compelling manner over the last few decades, especially since 1970s, when Antarctica was being seen in terms of its geological map. We all know that on the basis of the findings of US oil drilling ship Global Challenger. Evidence of oil and gas was also being found in the Ross Sea of the Antarctic. And then we had 1982 United Nations, in the backdrop of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. We had something called CAMELA, Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And then we had 1988, what is called CRAMRA, Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities. There was a crisis of consensus, and then 1990 we had Madrid Protocol, Antarctica Protocol and Environmental Protection, under which now Antarctica is being, all human activities in Antarctica are being subjected to environmental impact assessments. Fast forward 2048, the ban on mining can be lifted and subjected to a very stringent review, but it is possible theoretically. So 2048 is the time to watch. Now, what is it that I'm trying to convey? Number one, that here is a contested global commons. In my own work, I have also used the term global knowledge commons. I have also been talking about the tragedy of the global knowledge commons. If we say Antarctica, which I think that's the way we should look at it, that Antarctica is a contested global commons, but it is a global commons in the sense that it is very central to the epoch of the Anthropocene. It is very central to climate change debate. And we also know that if you go by the SCAR, Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research report, climate change report, there is a graphic evidence, and there was a reference made to the Western Antarctic ice sheet. About 20 meters of global sea level rise is locked up in the highly vulnerable parts of Antarctica. And West Antarctica ice sheet is very rightly pointed out earlier, is one of the tipping points. And more recent evidence, say I'm talking about the polar regions chapter of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 6th Assessment Report, also underlines the fact that what happens, the impacts of climate change on Antarctica, the Southern Ocean, will have global consequences, including the monsoon patterns for the monsoon Asia, so to speak. So one thing is very clear. I'm talking about the second part, interlinkages. Antarctica cannot be seen as, even if it is a contested global commons, in terms of isolated, disconnected. The same also applies to Arctic, but I'm focusing more on Antarctica. The manner in which the tropics, for example, are related to Antarctica. If we see that, if we were to see the West Antarctica ice sheets were collapsing, say, for example, in the Antarctic, the global sea level rise will not acknowledge the boundary between the Southern Ocean of the Antarctic and the other parts of the world ocean, in the Indian Ocean, Atlantic Ocean, and so on. So interlinkages are very, very obvious. What is needed? What is needed? I will talk about equity a little later. What is needed is transformations. Now, what kind of transformations are we looking at? If we have to avoid the tragedy of global knowledge commons, then we have to acknowledge that much more needs to be known about Antarctica, which means that the importance of science and scientific research as the first order value of Antarctica governance has to be retained. Now, the term peaceful uses of Antarctica, the preamble to the Antarctica Treaty said, Antarctica shall forever be governed for peaceful and scientific purposes in the best interests of humankind. The same Antarctica Treaty has legally frozen these territorial claims, but at the same time, there is a lot of emphasis on universality, on universalism. Now, which means that as and when we have the assertion of territorial nationalisms in Antarctica, and there are several examples, I don't want to go into them, they are always being tempered by this promise, by this commitment in the Antarctica Treaty preamble that Antarctica shall never become an object of international discord. So the transformations are of different kinds. First is a very deeply philosophical, but at the same time geopolitical transformation. And the question is, how do you transform the contested territoriality of Antarctica, which is coming in the way of governance, which is coming in the way of climate change related governance, say, for example. how do you turn it into trusteeship? How do you turn it into trusteeship? So the norm of trusteeship needs a lot of attention, also in the context of what we can call post-colonial engagement with the question of contested global commons, post-colonial engagement. The other kind of transformations, of course, will follow or will be facilitated. Antarctica Treaty system today is a very complex system. It has Antarctica Treaty. It has what we call the CAMELA, Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, having its headquarters in Hobart. And then after the environmental protocol, we have Committee on Environmental Protection. Membership has increased. It has become far more diversified than it ever was. Asia has a much more visible presence. Africa is still conspicuous by its absence in Antarctica governance. So the question then remains, who represents Antarctica? For whom does the Antarctica speak as a contested global commons, and the other way around? For whom does Antarctica speak? Does it speak for millions of people in Africa who are going through and who will be exposed to multiple exposures of climate change and the challenge of the Anthropocene? So there are deeply philosophical, geopolitical, legal questions that need to be addressed as a part of the transformation when we look at Antarctica. The third, again, is a related question of equity. Now, the point is, this is where we come to the knowledge power equation within the Antarctic Treaty system. There is juridical equality. All member states are there, but we still have a difference between the consultative members and those countries which demonstrate substantial scientific interest in Antarctica are eligible for being considered as consultative members. There are honorary members, there are observers, and so on. So we still have a system where we need much more dialogue, a much more democratic or dialogic politics in terms of agenda setting, in terms of negotiations, arriving at a consensus. Now, recently in the last meeting, we did see that the Ukraine crisis has also cast its shadow on the deliberations of the Antarctica Treaty Consultative Meeting, which was held in Berlin, in Germany. The next meeting is due in Finland, and then the thereafter, India would be hosting the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. So what I'm trying to say is that, be it transformations, be it the question of interlinkages, be it the question of equity, and I've just given a few selective examples, we need to pay a good deal of attention to Antarctica. To again sort of highlight one more point, and then I can probably stop, and that is that we have been talking about the high seas, right? We have been talking about spaces beyond them. Now, Antarctica Treaty does talk about the freedom of the high seas. As a matter of fact, if from a claimant country's point of view, there are coastal states in Antarctica. From the point of view of non-claimant countries, and countries, for example, countries like India, which do not recognize these territorial claims, the waters that go right up to the coast of Antarctica and the deep seabed in particular is the common heritage of mankind. So now, given the fact that during 90s there was a debate in the UN on the question of Antarctica, Antarctica Treaty system has been a little careful and cautious in terms of placing some of its major questions on the agendas of, say, for example, the United Nations or COPE. But Antarctica Treaty system now is far more willing to engage with IPCC work, to make its voice heard in COPE meetings. But at the end of the day, the challenge is that twofold. First, the countries, the Antarctic Treaty countries, which are scientifically active, are trying to mitigate climate change within the spaces of the Antarctic Treaty area south of 60 degrees south. So that is one way of saying that you are contributing to climate action, right? There's the Antarctic Treaty system specific climate action. But at the same time, the voice of Antarctica as the global commons also needs to be taken to other fora. Now the question is, who will do it? Whether it will be civil society, it is a global civil society, Antarctic Treaty parties themselves in their individual capacities, to convey a very strong message to the rest of the world that if Antarctica and also the Arctic, where the global, 4 times the global warming and so on, if they remain at the receiving end of global climate inaction, then the consequences are going to be devastating for the entire globe, particularly for small countries. So there is this element, small island states, and so on. So I think I'll stop here, Shelley, by underlining the importance of taking into account. Let us not stop at the high seas. Let us not stop at the Southern Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, Atlantic Ocean. Let us look beyond that. Look at the Antarctic, look at the Southern Ocean, and ask ourselves the question as to what is the importance, critical importance of this global commons, even if it remains contested, but it has remained peaceful, it has remained demilitarized, and one can really hope that future bodes well for Antarctic governments. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sachin Chaturvedi and Sanjay Chaturvedi. It's really like, your intervention was really enlightening. And the fact that even when we are talking about the oceans, all said and done, Antarctic and Arctic, and although they like Antarctic at least remains a contested global commons, will be a very vital part, and it should not be sort of left behind. And also, thank you so much for introducing the concept of tragedy of the global knowledge commons, which also needs to be addressed. And thank you so much. And we will incorporate these suggestions and make sure that, Antarctic, including the Convention on Marine Living Organisms, is also featured in our, interlinkage framework that we will propose to the policy brief. So thank you so much. Next, I would like to invite Mr. Martin Look, who is the Executive Director of Capitals Coalition. And Mr. Martin joined the Capital, he's the Executive Director of Capital Coalitions and joined the Capital Coalition in 2019. And before that, he was with the Netherlands government and worked in several policy areas, including biodiversity at both national and national levels, aspects related to green growth, environment policy, and natural resource policy. The screen is yours, Mr. Martin Look. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning to all of you, and thank you, Shelley, for inviting me to speak. I think you can hear me right? Yes, that's good. So very interesting conversation so far, and what I would like to do is to add to the conversation with a focus on how can we create a better understanding and linkage between the private and the public sector in respect to the question of managing better the global commons with a focus on the oceans, but also a little bit beyond. I'm speaking to you based on a lot of the ongoing discussions in the sphere of nature policies. You probably are aware that we are now globally negotiating a new nature framework, the Global Biodiversity Framework, that will hopefully come to an ambitious conclusion in a couple of months' time in Montreal. And I'm part of the Business for Nature policy team that is preparing all of the business messages around this negotiations. And based on that, I want to reflect on the questions that you're asking around reforms that are needed in relation to ocean and climate in the global commons, as well as how to mainstream and to build in equity a little bit better in the discussions. So that might sound a little bit weird or maybe of the discussion here, because we are focusing on oceans and climate. But one of the things we found out in our discussions that also link nature to climate as well as natural capital to the oceans discussions is that what we see is not only that there are global commons, but also there are a lot of common challenges in most of the discussions. And the kind of the policy messages that the business community is sending to UNFCCC is quite comparable to the ones that we are sending to the CBD. So I think there's a joint understanding needed here. I have two key messages that I would like to share with you in reaction to the questions. One is that what we really need is joint direction towards the global goals that are needed. And we need a joint direction that is able to create a kind of inspiration that all stakeholders need to bring in their contribution. And of course, we have the SDGs, but to put it frankly, the SDGs are, there are a lot of SDGs, 17 SDGs, so that's difficult sometimes to manage and to convey. And at the same time, within the context of the SDGs and the political discussions, climate is always on the top of a lot of the agendas. One of the things we are pressing for, we being the Capitals Coalition, I'm working with, but also the Business for Nature Coalition that is bringing together the business community around the CBD negotiation. We are really advocating to bring up a global goal comparable to 1.5 degrees for climate, a global goal for nature, saying that we need to move towards a nature positive world in 2030, where we have more nature compared to the current situation. We always combine that with that we also need a social equitable situation. So the global goal we rally behind is to become nature positive, climate neutral, and social equitable. And that's kind of a summary to me of the SDGs. And it is very important to have such a joint direction. One of the reasons for that is that we have all those international agreements working in parallel, but not always aligned sufficiently. So we need to align the international conventions and specifically also in the field or in regarding the way how they are implemented. So most countries have different implementation strategies for nature, for climate, for oceans, while at the same time, the underlying causes why things are going in the wrong direction are quite comparable, and also the policies needed are quite comparable. So you're talking about mainstreaming. And what I found out already when I used to work for the Dutch government, you referred to that, we are always talking about mainstreaming. Everyone is talking about mainstreaming. And at the same time, it really is a challenge. My experience is, why is it a challenge? Because usually we talk about mainstreaming without having the people, the sectors, the organizations in the same room that we think should mainstream biodiversity, oceans, climate, whatever. So it's always talking about mainstreaming, about what others should do instead of bringing them on board. And to me, the key thing on mainstreaming is to really include all stakeholders and have a discussion together. And this also goes back strongly to what we are working on as Capitals Coalition. So we are a global coalition to transform the way how decisions are made by business, by finance, as well as by governments. And what we need for this is a joint understanding of what is the value of nature, of people, of society, and how can we include that. And the only way how we can do that is if we really bring this together. And that's not always happening. One element of that is also, and this is the kind of the ambition loop we use in the context of Business for Nature too. What is really important is that we link the positive actions from the private sector, business as well as finance, to creating an enabling environment by governments. And to be honest, what governments are doing is not always aligned within their own structure. So a lot of times, for example, in relation to nature as well as to oceans, they expect the private sector to take certain actions, but then the government policies themselves are not aligned with that. For example, we published a report on nature in February, which stated that 1.8 trillion US dollars is spent by global governments on environmental harmful activities, which is not good. So we need to reform those elements. Another thing which really is important is if we want all actors to mainstream, they should assess and disclose their impacts and their dependencies on nature, on the oceans, and it should be mandatory for them to do that. So this is an advocacy campaign we are currently running towards the CBD. Also, for businesses active in the oceans area. And this is, to be honest, a little bit of a struggle. We started to look at oceans already around 2016 when we published a natural capital protocol, which is a kind of a 9-step approach for business to how to include impacts and dependencies on nature. And there's a comparable protocol for social and human capital too. But what we see is that the discussions between the business community and the government community are not always coming together. So governments are implementing the ecosystems accounting framework set out by the United Nations Statistical Department, UNSD, the SIA framework, and they are rolling this out also in the oceans. But when we are in contact with countries and ask them, how's the involvement of business in this accounting? They will need the same kind of information. In a lot of cases, there's not already that setup. Where we think for the mainstreaming, you need to bring together what business, what government and finance is doing. So that is a huge thing that we need to invest in. So having said that, back to you, Shelley. Happy to answer further questions or join the discussions following all of the first interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you so much for bringing in the point that even the private sector is a very big stakeholder, and mainstreaming really can't happen without really having their perspectives. And so also putting forward that concrete recommendation about having compulsory disclosures by the private sector and businesses on the dependence on oceans, and the global commons. And thank you so much for your intervention. And of course, we will come back later also towards the end once all the speakers have had to speak. I would now like to invite Mr. Martin Curry, who is with the Economist Group. He's a senior manager there with sustainability, climate change, and natural resources. And he has also worked in past with, he's been with the World Ocean Initiative, as well as he's been with, he's been with the New Economics Foundation, which really, puts forward very bold ideas concerning current paradigms that are there. But also has been an advisory member of UNEP's Global Environmental Outlook for Business. We welcome, from the various diverse points, you come from, and, we welcome your perspectives. The screen is yours, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and also thanks a lot to all the other speakers, and thanks for having me. It's been enlightening and great to be at this stage that can kind of absorb the information from the other panelists. And I just want to follow up on some of the points made. I think Martin Locke made some great points there about the mainstreaming and actually valuing nature. There's going to be a conference actually next week where we'll be speaking, and some of you might not be aware of. So I'm just going to put the link in the chat here, which is exactly about that topic. It's about valuing natural capital, and it's actually about how do we actually put a value. And I know there are lots of different definitions of value, and that will also be part of it: economic, social, sentimental, cultural value of nature, but particularly around the tools to develop, the economic tools to develop this kind of natural capital accounting and so on. So that's going to be a really interesting conference. There were also a couple of great points that were made about about the Arctic, and actually we and the knowledge gaps, and you know, some of the previous speakers, Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi, for example, talking about the knowledge gap of the global commons, and particularly mentioning the Arctic there, and I just wanted to highlight that we actually did a film to at the Economist Group to highlight the you know, these kind of topics about the protection of the Arctic, and the need to actually look at this from a scientific but also from an economic point of view. And for example, just conveying that knowledge about the coral reefs in the Arctic, which often is forgotten as a natural capital in terms of mitigating climate change, because I mean, unlike trees or sea kelp, for example, the calcium carbonate structure that that is in corals permanently locks up carbon, and is often forgotten that this is actually a much better way of storing carbon, a much better way of dealing with climate change than many other ways in terms of natural capital. And we did this film to raise awareness about this. So I just want to highlight the importance of knowledge. Is not just the scientific knowledge. It is also translating that knowledge into something that decision makers, policy makers, business, finance can understand. And although scientific papers are absolutely crucial for that, it is that translation that comes through, for example, media, through kind of more kind of actionable insights that can be drawn from these scientific studies that are crucial. And something that Dr. Kapil Narula said is also really important, resonates with the work we do, for example, on blue finance. We actually look a lot at these kind of financial tools that he mentioned in terms of debt for nature, source blue bonds and these kind of things, insurance tools. And there's a vast kind of knowledge there that we've produced on blue finance. We kind of tracking latest blue finance developments at the World Ocean Initiative. There's some of the things that he mentioned are vital, and particularly around that knowledge gap on deep sea mining and these kind of things. We also did a film on that, just to highlight why there is this conversation. Often it's that finance perspective that Martin Locke mentioned that is crucial, because even if we come up with governance solutions, it's important that we get all the different stakeholders on board. And there are a lot of business stakeholders and even governments that are interested in deep sea mining because of the potential economic benefits, and understanding that language that they use and understanding their reasoning is absolutely vital. That's why I've just shared that link there. But I just wanted to kind of react also to the guiding questions, and many of the things that were discussed are something that obviously resonates with us as well. The work that we've done at the World Ocean Initiative and Economist Impact, and some of this is obviously related to how can we, in terms of the first question, how can we govern global commons better? And there are several dimensions. I mean, one was already mentioned in terms of the political and legal, and the High Seas Treaty that was mentioned by some of the previous speakers is absolutely vital. I'm less pessimistic than the recent speakers in terms of where we are with that. Because actually, as was pointed out, this has been 20 years in the making, but we are actually getting much closer to that than previously. I mean, obviously there are some sticking points, but it's not easy to establish these kind of agreements on marine protected areas on the high seas, to get agreement on these impact assessments and providing the finance and capacity building. And obviously the biggest sticking point is sharing of marine genetic resources, and that's where the equity angle comes in. It's about what do we do with these kind of biological material from plants and animals in the ocean, and if it has benefits for society, pharmaceuticals, industrial processes, food, and these kind of things. And of course, one of the sticking points is how do we share that? And in a way, there has been progress on that at the recent talks. And although the agreement was supposed to be finalized this year, even if it's delayed by a couple of months, we are much closer than we have been at any other point in the past 20 years. I would definitely be more optimistic about that. And that brings me also to the point around the need, to look at this kind of transformation. I mean, what kind of transformation is required? And I think a couple of the previous speakers, Martin Locke and others, have highlighted the need to bring business into this. And this can be done through through an economic transformation. So there obviously needs to be the government's transformation that we mentioned, the mainstreaming, the global framework such as CBD, High Seas Treaty, and so on. But what is required is an accompanying economic model that can then be embraced, because governance in a way is important to set the scene, but for what? I mean, so we have the governance structures in place. If they're not implemented, monitored, and so on, they're meaningless. And the way to get the buy-in, the political will and the ambition from governments to actually do things is by bringing the business community and economic stakeholders in it, that will eventually help to build a business case, an economic case for it, and ultimately bring society into this as well. And this economic model is being discussed currently, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of Ralph Sharmy, for example, from the International Monetary Fund, who is now kind of on a sabbatical, who has set up Rebalance Earth and others. He will be speaking at this conference that I shared the link for. And he is one of those thought leaders that is at the forefront of this new economic thinking around the nature-based economy. And I think all the government structures that we talk about ultimately will have to have something like this associated with it. And this is really about translating nature into kind of economic terms and establishing as a kind of a new financial asset class. And that really brings all this to life and makes it more tangible for decision makers, and also brings the business and economic stakeholders into it. And the idea is here to give monetary value to living nature as opposed to extracting and destroying natural assets. I mean, in the past, as we know from all of the things that have led to climate change, it's been about extraction and destruction of resources. So the oil, the gas, the trees that are cut down, all these things are about killing something, destroying something to fuel the economy. Instead, the new economic model is about the value is in the living nature. It's in the elephant that is there as a carbon sink. It's in the whale that is there alive that is a carbon sink. It's the trees that are alive that are breathing. It's the ocean, coral reefs that are alive and not dead that store all that carbon and so on. So it's about the monetary value of living nature, and that's the new economic model. And there is data to support that. The value of a whale, for example, in terms of carbon sequestration, has been estimated at $3 million. Hasn't been done in the past. I mean, that's really new. These kind of valuing natural capital assessments. The carbon capture services of seagrass have been estimated at $2.3 trillion. I mean, all these things are important for exactly the points that some of the previous speakers did about the knowledge. And we need to translate this knowledge for decision makers that are meaningful. And putting an economic value on these kind of things is actually really important to highlight how important the ocean economy is. And this is something at the World Ocean Initiative that we do all the time to highlight these, this $3 trillion a year that the ocean contributes to the global economy through food security, transport, energy, tourism, critical ecosystem service, and so on. And that's really important for building this economic case to go alongside the governance. And one critical point I wanted to highlight is the economics of blue carbon. And we've just highlighted that it's important to put governance structures around that, because blue carbon is a really important way of linking the climate and nature conversation, because it's about creating markets that make some of these kind of protection solutions for nature to make them into an economic opportunity. We've just done, an article on that to highlight the need for these blue carbon markets. They're already happening in a way. And ultimately, this is about bringing these kind of new innovations, because governance only works to in a way, create the framework for innovations, such as these kind of blue carbon markets. And then the finance will come in. So governance can only work in combination with innovation and finance. And in terms of innovation, there are lots of really great things happening in the ocean. We've just concluded our Ocean Changemakers Challenge to highlight some of those young research, and I know that you're doing this kind of work as well at TERI and others, that you're highlighting how there are great ideas out there, but how do we finance them, and how do we create the governance structures to make them happen? And through the Ocean Changemakers Challenge, we're trying that. There's also the UNDP Ocean Innovation Challenge, Uplink Blue Carbon Challenge. There are all these kind of things that bring young people and innovations into this. So it's just important to highlight that we need to link all of the things we talk about to ultimately the great ideas that new innovators come up with. And in terms of the social dimension, the equity dimension, is absolutely vital that some of the previous speakers highlighted traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge. There are some really good examples of that. I mean, we're going to have our World Ocean Tech and Innovation Summit next month in Halifax in Canada. And there is also the need to bring in some of that indigenous knowledge. I mean, in Canada as well, there are indigenous communities that have great knowledge in terms of conserving and regenerating the ocean, because they have needed to do that for generations, for their own survival, and you know, because they are very much connected to nature, which the connection we have often lost. So bringing that indigenous communities into it is absolutely important. And speaking about blue carbon as well, in the study that I've just shared, we looked at in Kenya in the Mikoko Pamoja example, which is basically a mangrove forest that has been certified by a global certification organization, Plan Vivo, and they are basically selling those carbon credits. And this is absolutely vital for those communities. But it's important that those communities buy into that solution and that they're seeing the value in this. So, for example, they are buying school books for children from this, and so on. And they're working with other stakeholders to make sure that this is not just something that is done above communities' heads, but it's something that is done with communities. So yeah, so I just wanted to highlight these kind of crucial linkages between governance, finance, and innovation. And we have seen in COP26 some of those initiatives, the biggest blue bond ever in Belize. I mean, something really to build on. The world's biggest marine protected area, Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor. And all this is obviously aimed at helping this 30 by 30 goal. But of course, there's also the need to bring governance structure into this. And there are some already, like the Pacific Islands Forum has come up with this declaration of preserving maritime zones in the face of climate change, sea level rise. So there is definitely the governance structure emerging around this 30 by 30 goal, but there's definitely a need to do more around that. And I think, some of the speakers already mentioned the NDCs and the importance of doing that. And I think COP26 really brought that to life through the Seychelles with their basically including the blue economy and ocean adaptation in their NDCs. And I think, at COP, there was this really interesting stat that now, more than 50 countries from coastal countries have now included an ocean element in the NDC. So this is something to really build on as we go into COP27 and COP28. And just to highlight as well that this sectoral approach, although it's difficult sometimes because it can hinder this mainstreaming, is important as well, because we need to tailor the solutions for the sector. So for example, for shipping, there's been a long-standing conversation around decarbonization. Of course, the IMO decarbonization plan is not Paris compliant. So the Clydebank Declaration, for example, at COP26 is aimed at creating this kind of zero carbon shipping lanes and so on. So bringing shipping into Paris, and it is important to have these sectoral agreements as well as the overarching global initiatives. And just finally, the Great Blue Wall Initiative is another way of bringing in these different stakeholders, because it's about nature in a way, because the IUCN conserved areas categories were used to create this project, but it also includes all these kind of elements that are linked to climate change in terms of critical carbon sinks, mangrove, seagrass, coral reefs, and so on. So these kind of initiatives are really important to connect nature and climate. And just finally on the equity discussion, because that's obviously a really important conversation, just highlighting again, following on from what I mentioned earlier in terms of bringing communities into it, for example, the blue carbon communities. It is also important that the Great Blue Wall, for example, included different countries from different development statuses. So, for example, France, Ireland, but also Kenya, Mozambique, Tanzania, the UK, the US, Sweden. Is really an initiative by the Global North and the Global South. And it also involves indigenous and local communities. So these are the kind of things, these are the kind of initiatives we need to build on. So on that optimistic note, I'd like to finish.
Thank you so much, Martin, for also introducing so much of optimism about this issue in hand. And of course, I'm sometimes I just feel that of course it is important to value things. My career also started in the stock market investment field. Yes, for decision making you need to value or monetize things, but it's also not possible in all instances. For example, in India, we have the National Environment Policy, and Dr. Ghosh, who made the opening remarks, he was the one who architected it. We also have a term called in that policy, entities of incomparable value, or there are entities you cannot value them at all. They're just invaluable, like nature, endangered species. And of course, this meets with the incommensurability principle in ecological economics. So that is also there. So of course, valuation is important, but it may not become possible to come up with the correct value. And some aspects you have to just exercise the precautionary principle. So, but just wanted to flag that we'll come to the point later. Now I'd just like to invite Dr. Pushp Bajaj. He is a research fellow and the head of the Blue Economy and Climate Change Cluster at the National Maritime Foundation in New Delhi, India. And he's also been recently recognized as a fellow of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And I understand he has a PhD in chemistry and from the University of California, and a very interesting interdisciplinary background. And he will really be like bringing in some valuable perspectives. The screen is yours, Pushp.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Kedia, and thank you to the organizers at TERI for giving me the opportunity to participate in this discussion. A lot has been said already, and I certainly concur with all the thoughts that have been put forward, and maybe what I'll just try to do is amplify some of those things that have already been said with some of the thoughts of my own. Speaking about the challenges associated, the governance and challenges associated with the protection and conservation of areas beyond national jurisdiction, the high seas. We have spoken about the BBNJ treaty and how that is a much needed step that we are waiting for that to convert into a more binding sort of legal framework. But I think that we must also understand and appreciate simply the implementation challenges that are associated with protecting areas beyond national jurisdiction. There are financial, technological, and logistical challenges that are associated with protection, conservation of marine protected areas. And this also takes us to the fact that there are simply countries which do not have the capacity or the capability to address those challenges in the high seas. If you take the example of India, even with all the capacity that India has, there aren't any, to the best of my knowledge, there aren't any marine protected areas outside the territorial seas of India. There was a talk of, there is a proposal of an area outside India's territorial seas in the exclusive economic zone to be designated as a protected area, but it is still in the proposal phase. And we also have issues related to transboundary conservation of marine resources. We do have shared maritime expanses with Bangladesh, for example, with Sri Lanka, and we have very rich biodiversity in those regions. And in order for us to kind of protect and conserve that biodiversity, we certainly need greater cooperation between bilateral cooperation, also multilateral cooperation to kind of protect those areas which are beyond our national jurisdiction and might be in some other country's national jurisdiction. So, coming back to the point of the implementation challenges, most of the countries simply do not have that capacity to implement those marine protected areas in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And so therefore, the lead has to come from nations that are more equipped to deal with those challenges, the developed parts of the world that do have the financial and technological capacity to address those challenges. And that also brings in the question of equity and making sure that we address the challenges, we address the concerns of the developing countries in those initiatives. Coming to the point of what kind of transformations need to happen in order to facilitate this kind of global governance kind of a situation. I would like to point out that in addition to the points that have been mentioned before, India is clearly putting more emphasis on oceans and the oceans, how to protect and conserve ocean resources, and also how to utilize them in a more sustainable manner. And this is clearly visible in India's policy, recent policy decisions. For example, the Maritime India Vision 2030, the Sagarmala program, and also the draft Blue Economy policy that has come out. And one of the previous speakers spoke about how we need to incorporate all stakeholders in the decisions surrounding oceans, which are, of course, utilized and a common space. So I am quite, India historically has not been very kind of successful in doing that, successful in bringing all the stakeholders on the table. However, there is, optimism in the draft Blue Economy policy, which speaks about bringing all the stakeholders together in a Blue Economy Committee. Which would be formulated at the national level, and all the different stakeholders will be part of the committee and will be part of the decision-making process, which shows a step forward, and it is certainly different from the Maritime India Vision 2030, which was primarily an initiative of the Ministry of Port Shipping and Waterways. This Blue Economy policy would most likely be a joint effort, and it will show some sort of inputs from all stakeholders that are involved. Now, doing that at a global scale is, of course, much more challenging, and that's kind of what was brought up by some of the previous speakers. Going forward in this, what are the transformations that are required? Of course, we need to strengthen the existing frameworks for ocean cooperation. For example, the BIMSTEC, the Indian Ocean Rim Association, and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was announced very recently in 2019. And all of these frameworks do have potential to increase cooperation when it comes to ocean governance and also protection and conservation of marine biodiversity. In this context, I think it was Dr. Narula who also mentioned the knowledge gap and the scientific capacity gap. Here, again, coming to the same point that we need the technology, we need the capacity and capability to be available across different countries in order to address this. And that also brings in the question of sharing of this knowledge, sharing of this data, and creating frameworks to do that. For example, there is the Information Fusion Center of the Indian Ocean region. There is the European Union's project Primario, which talks about data sharing and also enhancing awareness of the maritime domain. So all of those things need to kind of cooperate and need to contribute to this idea of generating overall awareness of the maritime domain, because it is simply, although we are aware of the illegal activities that are taking place in the maritime domain, the challenges associated with piracy, the challenges associated with illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. A lot of it is simply too difficult to tackle because of the vast nature of the high seas. It is simply, unenforceable for one nation, certainly not enforceable for a developing country to have that kind of, capacity to deal with those issues in the high seas. So these challenges demand cooperation in the scientific arena, in the data sharing arena, and also in security arena. Finally, just a couple of more points regarding the equity question. I think that we all recognize that the Paris Agreement does talk about equity. It does continue the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities and different national circumstances. But I think that if we look at the evolution of this concept, we will certainly appreciate that it has taken a hit. It has taken a hit from when it started, from the 1990s, the Rio Summit and the Kyoto Protocol. The language has changed quite a bit. And I mean, it is, of course, my personal opinion that it has been those principles of the Kyoto Protocol of CBDR have been diluted successfully to some extent by the developed countries, and the language has been shifted to incorporate all parties, going from the Kyoto Protocol's Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 kind of division to now the Paris Agreement, which talks about contribution from all parties. Now, I'm not saying that all parties, or all, in this case, parties corresponding to the member parties of the UNFCCC, that all parties should not contribute to climate action. Of course, we should, and there is a responsibility for us to do that. But the kind of the evolution does tell us that we are there has been an attempt to dilute this language, and it has been successful to some extent. So we have to continue pushing for this idea, the united front of the developing world, in saying that there is historical responsibility in the developed countries, which is much higher than the historical responsibility of the developing countries. And therefore, there is a higher kind of accountability which needs to be addressed through the mechanisms that were discussed before about climate financing and loss and damage and things like that. And that was aptly brought out by Prime Minister Narendra Modi at COP26, when he asked for developed countries to increase support from 100 billion, which was mentioned before. $100 billion was the previous climate financing target, and he asked for the developed countries to raise that to 1 trillion, which is a more commensurate number to kind of help the developing countries come out of the challenges associated with climate change. There are many other points, but in considering the paucity of time, I'll stop here, and thank you all for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Pushp, and also thank you so much for bringing forth the point that even regional organizations and frameworks like the BIMSTEC also become important, when we talk about, ocean governance, and also the interface with climate governance, and also again, reiterating the fact that when it comes to equity, CBTR, capacities, knowledge, these are all very important things. Thank you so much, Pushp. I'd like to now invite Ms. Ashwini Hengne, who is a senior manager in the climate program at the World Resources Institute, India. And by training, she is a policy researcher and economist. And she currently, kind of leads the just transition and equity work in the climate program. And we hope to learn more from you, Ashwini, especially on aspects related to equity. The screen is yours, Ashwini.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly. Yeah. All right. So hello, everyone, and thanks so much, Shelley and Nivedita, for having me here. It's been an extremely enlightening session so far for me personally. I come more from a climate background, and over a period of time, there has been more importance and more acknowledgement of the importance of oceans, and rightly so. And to me, all of this has been quite useful to even listen to. And what I was doing, in my mind as I was hearing, was really drawing parallels to, how the climate discourse has evolved, and how the oceans and in general global commons discourse needs to again sort of bring in some of those aspects. So let me just begin by, highlighting some of the key challenges that we commonly see in these kinds of issues of the global commons, and the kind of complexities that have made it harder. So I mean, and again, I'll draw parallels to the climate discourse, and even when I talk about the solutions, I'll speak more from a climate perspective, but try to sort of bring in the oceans aspect as well as I can. But so specifically with the climate discourse, and some of the previous speakers have also alluded to it, is the fact that even though it is a very typical commons problem, there has always been a few things that have made it even more complicated. So the first thing is the fact that there is a relative difference in the circumstances of the stakeholders. So whether we look at it from the lens of a historical contribution or even the current contribution, to even the fact that there are certain actors or players who have a certain level of development and well-being, while there are others who don't even have their basic needs met so far. There's also a difference in the level of ambition in terms of action versus the ones who will actually face the brunt of climate impact. And the fact is that while there are some, the fact is that there are some whose responsibilities far exceed the impacts they will ever face. And also the fact that, there are those whose ability to take action far exceeds those of others. So inherently, there is this difference in the respective circumstances of different stakeholders and the need for them to act as well as manage the impacts of climate change, as well as of the other global commons. The second is the fact that most of these impacts that we're talking about, be it climate impacts or of the oceans, the issue is that these are not extremely local or immediate. So an action today will not have an immediate consequence which is visible to the same contributors, and this obscures the vision for even the most well-intentioned actors. So I mean, these two are the key reasons why there is, a lack of momentum or awareness as much as it should, and the urgency that is required. At the same time, over the past several years, there are certain shifts that have been taking place which are positive. So one is the fact that there is acknowledgement of the differences. So be it the way it has been enshrined in the Paris Agreement, as imperfectly as it has been implemented, and also the acknowledgement of the need that there needs to be more support coming in financially as well as in terms of capacities towards the most vulnerable. Again, here there is a lot of room for corrective action as well as more efficient action. And the second shift is the fact that we are already seeing the impacts of climate change. So be it the heat waves, the floods, the forest fires, it's no longer something that is far away in the future or is limited to a few geographies. It's happening across the world in the global south as much as in the north, and therefore there is more more realization of the fact that it is affecting everybody and it is also affecting business. And so these two key shifts make us hopeful that the kind of urgency that is required has become more obvious to us than ever before. And with that, I would like to focus on just 4 points. I mean, of course, I agree with a lot of the points that have been made, and there is a lot of sort of ways in which we could look at these potential transformations. But I'll just highlight 4 that I think are relevant to our topic today. The first is that of scale, which is that when we talk about be it climate change or managing the global oceans, we always talk about a very large scale, which it is, and which requires in cooperation at the highest levels, at the international level across countries, especially given the differences in the kind of situations the countries in. And while things like Paris Agreement build on some of the design principles which Eleanor Ostrom had laid out, she has herself asserted that we cannot wait for change to come from the top. And therefore, I believe that even in this space, the pace and scale of change that is needed has to be driven at all levels. So not just global and international levels, but also national, subnational, and local levels. And this is primarily for 2 reasons. The first is that greater climate action, and I'm again giving an example of climate action at any level, has the potential to create a positive feedback loop, which I think even Martin spoke about. And this can essentially simulate greater action, and mobilize people to take action even at the international levels, which again then feeds back into greater action at an individual level, at businesses and other actors. And one such example is of the states, cities, and businesses that continue to stay committed to, and in fact helped ramp up their ambition in the United States. And this was despite United States backing out of the Paris Agreement in the interim. Eventually, the Americas Pledge movement, as they call themselves, actually mobilized public support and pushed the discourse in America towards finally them reinstating their commitment to the Paris Agreement. And we need similar examples of it, across the board, where we don't need to wait for international treaties, although they are the ones that will create the scale of impact that's needed. But there can be action that can be done at the national level, as the previous speaker spoke about, the things that are happening in India as well as other countries, that need to be amplified and that need to be then reconnected back to the global discourse in order to mobilize more action. And the second is that while most of these actions and initiatives happen at the national level, the impacts are extremely localized, especially to the local communities, coastal regions, and the economies that are dependent on them. So corrective actions that are taken even at a national and subnational level can benefit the people who might be most affected by it. So we see the kind of developments that are happening in our coastal areas, and corrective actions even at that scale have a potential of safeguarding the people and communities that are dependent on them. The second important transformation I think needs to come about is that any system of cooperation needs to also ensure accountability, without which there is always a issue of the free riders that that might not act enough, as well as discouraging others who might really want to take action. And historically, as we have seen, there has been very little accountability that has been enforced really. So be it towards either the fact that there have been people, or there have been major contributors to the global climate crisis, or be it defaulters of reduction targets or defaults even on commitments made on finance. And this remains as one of the key weaknesses of our times. And this again sort of translates to the kinds of needs that we need to incorporate in any sort of global treaties or initiatives, which is that without real accountability and commensurate penalties, there's very little hope of our collective climate or other goals of the future to be realized. And so firstly, this will mean mobilizing and being accountable for financing not just things like decarbonization and adaptation, but also looking at things like loss and damage because of the climate impacts that are already upon us, as well as enabling a just transition, so that even as climate policies or low carbon policies are implemented, people and communities that might be impacted due to these actions are also taken along and are not left behind in that sense. And the second, of course, is to the need to ensure that adequate consequences to defaulters of their own targets are enshrined, without which there's very little incentive for everyone to act and to avoid free riders. The third point I want to make is really on enabling inclusive climate action, and here we need to look beyond what needs to be done, but also on procedural justice and looking at how things need to be implemented, to not just talk about the larger schemes and technological solutions, but also the local governance and policy making processes. And as researchers, we also need to identify uh, recommendations and ways in which we can create avenues for engagement with the local communities, with vulnerable countries, and really bring them and their voices to the platforms in order to inform what is needed to be done, so that the people who are most affected have a say in the decisions that are made. And these platforms again have to happen at the local level, at regional levels, as well as international level, where people who are the most who have more skin in the game, so to speak, are the ones who have the real seat at the table and whose voices actually matter. And the final intervention that I had in mind was also really to create engagement at scale. So only now we are seeing, the kind of discourse around climate change, and the public consciousness has actually reached public consciousness, so to speak. And this has been enabled through a lot of not just of course it is the impacts that we're already seeing, but it is also due to engagement with popular figures, with people like Greta Thunberg. There's also actually a term called as the Greta Thunberg effect, which actually says that people who are more familiar with Greta Thunberg have a more stronger sense of collective efficacy, that that if they sort of raise their voice and they really ask for action, I mean, they believe that it will have a consequence, and that just sort of encourages people towards more collective actions towards reducing global warming. And it's similar in other commons issues as well, where unless the public and the people at large are engaged with the issue may not really find its importance that it deserves. And therefore, it is important as researchers and as the civil society to also engage with different stakeholders in this space in order to really build the awareness, and also take the conversation beyond just beyond just heads of states and technical experts, because then again there is a way to really mobilize the need for action and the need for really creating change. And I think these are mostly like very brief points that I wanted to add to what's already been said, and I'm aware that we are a little bit over time as well, so I'll stop here and I'll be happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ashwini, and thank you so much for highlighting the fact that the aspect of scale is important, and the fact that yes, also we have to look at multi-level governance, institutional structures, but also focus on implementation, accountability aspects. So thank you so much, Ashwini, for flagging that and for sharing your thoughts. And I do agree that we do need to have inclusive climate action, considering that climate will be impacting those who are most vulnerable. Of course, we have run out of time indeed. But let us kind of continue to stay in touch. And after this event, we'll also be circulating a questionnaire to all the speakers, in case they want to provide any further inputs, especially with respect to the fact, as to what to expect with regard to global commons in the upcoming COP27 and beyond, actually, not just for the COP27, but because certainly this is going to be an agenda which will need much longer, but I hope to not too longer, but because we have to act now. So we'll stay in touch, and I think it's been a very, very enriching discussion, and on a topic which is normally not. In fact, we were initially a little skeptical about the interest we would receive, but it is very, very encouraging to see that so many attendees have joined us. Even for this slightly considered offbeat topic when we talk about climate action, because it's certainly not as fashionable or as mainstream rather, like climate mitigation or net zero or adaptation. But we as an institute thought that it is important to raise issues around global commons, because at the end we have to take a systems approach when we talk about earth systems, and hence talking about global commons is very, very, very important. But I'd like to once again thank the speakers, our partners who've supported us, and please do stay tuned, and please be in touch. But just before I wrap up, I just see some of the speakers, just in case, do you want to make one quick, there's just one recommendation you want to make for COP27? Professor Chaturvedi, Kapil, do you want to quickly come in on that?
What I would say is that it's important to pay attention to specific institutional settings and arrangements where the global commons question is being addressed, like for example the Antarctic Treaty system, and strengthen those voices, strengthen those perspectives, because we have one narrative that comes from the floor of the Antarctic Treaty consultative meetings, which is very important. Antarctica has remained peaceful. It has been subjected to multilateral governance, but the voice of the place, as I said, who speaks for the global commons, who speaks for this somewhat exceptional, and I think it is important to keep polar regions exceptional as well as they get globalized. Then how do we ensure that the voice of the place, even if it is the voice of the penguins and the non-humans in the Antarctic ecosystems, how do we strengthen those perspectives and voices at other fora, whether it is IPCC or it is Scopes, or any other? So this requires solidarity. This requires some kind of a global socio-spatial ecological consciousness, and I think this calls for very innovative kind of networking between both of the formal kind as well as informal kind. So I think that would be my key message. Let not these global commons and their voices and perspectives get eclipsed by the mainstream understanding of what global commons are all about. And let us join together in this movement for the sake of entire humanity, not just the human, but also the non-human. So Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam phrase needs to be further broadened and deepened. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I so very much agree with you, because we have to also talk about interspecies equity and, not just look at it from a very human-centric perspective. Kapil, do you want to come in? And Apush, then you want to come in? Just one very quick, last message, considering that we are on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh COP27.
Yeah, just 3 words. I think focus on implementation, implementation, and implementation. We don't have to wait for COP. We can start now. Local action, national action, they don't have to wait. Yes, ABNJ and other bigger things can wait, but true to the COP, the message or the highlight of the COP this year is the focus is on implementation. So let's see something coming out of it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kapil. Push, do you want to go? And Martin, then do you want to go? Final thoughts, since we are on the road to Sharm el-Sheikh.
Sure, I'll just add that, I mean, it was very nicely pointed out that oceans have in fact been missing in the UNFCCC COPs, the global ocean conversations related to the global ocean. And it was only, I think, the COP26 which comprehensively addressed the topic of ocean. So going forward with the COP27 and also the future COPs and other regional forums, I think they have to start addressing the ocean in a more comprehensive manner and go beyond kind of the superficial conversations and go into, as Dr. Narula said, into the implementation and the nitty-gritty of things. So more focused discussions, side discussions, follow-on discussions on the ocean and the global commons would be critical. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Push. Martin?
So it was really interesting to follow the conversation and share the stage with the other panelists. I mean, I think just to reiterate that, governance is really important. We also need to look at why it is important. I mean, really to enable innovation and to kind of help provide the right incentives and structures for these collaborations that we've talked about, the mainstreaming and so on, and on the financial, economic, and also the business side. And this will kind of, ultimately help to address these equity concerns that we've talked about as well. And I think a good example of this is the creation of blue carbon markets. It's a very practical example of how governance, innovation, finance can work hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Martin. And again, for bringing in fact the perspectives that, the markets are also there. I mean, all said and done, when we're talking about the world, the states, the governments, that's one pillar. The markets are another pillar. And how do we sort of work, or perhaps, in matters of global commons, the states will have a larger role to play. But then, the fact is that we have to be very mindful of the fact that, that markets is a very big institution that is out there, and somewhere, one will have to see where there can be synergies. So thank you so much. But, I also see Ashwini, my colleague Ashwini on the screen, and she's been working on oceans issues for a long. Ashwini, is there anything that you'd like to say before we close the meeting? So Ashwini, I just saw you and then we just lost you. So, but anyway, I'd just like to say that, thank you so much. And all the discussions have been very, very informative. And we will, this will feed into our policy brief. And we look forward to staying in touch with all of you. And please consider this as a very small initiative. And we do hope that even for, going forward, we can perhaps, work together in, sort of ensuring that global commons as such, and by global commons, of course, seeing that, we take an Earth systems approach, considering all aspects, it gets larger attention in the mainstream discussions. Thank you again so much for all of you for being here, for enriching us, for sparing your value, for sparing your time, and indeed really like enlightening us and educating us on various aspects. Thank you so much, and we look forward.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.